It was Halloween night, and I was the only one left at the cemetery. The shadows stretched long and dark across the tombstones, the cold wind biting through my jacket. The only sound was the rhythmic clang of my shovel as I worked, breaking through the hardened ground. They didn't pay me extra for nights like this, but the way I saw it, someone had to keep the place running. So there I was, digging away, surrounded by the dead. The plot I was working on was an old one, tucked in the far corner of the graveyard where no one ever went. The ground was thick with roots and dense clay, making each swing of the shovel more grueling than the last. I wiped the sweat from my brow and took a quick glance around. Not a soul in sight, just me and the rows of headstones standing like silent sentinels. As I dug, my shovel hit something hard. I thought it was just a rock, but as I cleared away the dirt, I saw the edge of a decayed wooden box. It was much older than the usual graves I dealt with, its wood rotten and splintered. My curiosity got the better of me, and I knelt down, brushing away the dirt with my hands. The coffin lid was loose, almost like it had been waiting for someone to open it. I hesitated, a strange sense of unease prickling at the back of my neck. But the night was still, and I figured, what's the harm? I pried the lid open, and the stench hit me like a brick wall. The body inside was little more than bones wrapped in tattered rags, a skull staring back at me with hollow, empty eyes. But something wasn't right. The bones were twisted, clawing at the sides of the coffin like they had been trying to get out. My heart began to race, and I stood up, backing away from the grave. That's when I heard it, the faint sound of shuffling. I turned around, but the graveyard was empty, just as it had been moments before. Yet as I listened, the shuffling grew louder, closer, until I could feel the ground tremble beneath my feet. My eyes scanned the graves around me, and that's when I saw it. One by one, the earth began to shift, small mounds of dirt rising from each grave. A skeletal hand burst through the soil not far from where I stood, clawing its way to the surface. Then another, and another. I stumbled back, tripping over a loose stone as more and more hands reached out from the earth, pulling themselves free from their graves. My chest tightened, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I scrambled to my feet, my only thought to get away from this place, to leave the dead to their restless sleep. But as I turned, the skeletal figure I had disturbed stood in my path, its empty eye sockets somehow locked onto me. It lifted a bony hand, pointing in my direction, and an unnatural chill washed over me. I backed away, but the other figures were closing in, surrounding me with their empty, silent stares. I could feel their anger, their hunger for revenge seeping into the air, thick and suffocating. They inched closer, skeletal fingers reaching for me, and I knew I was trapped. The ground beneath my feet felt soft, like it was ready to swallow me whole. And in that moment I realized the horrifying truth: they weren't going to let me leave, not until I paid for disturbing their graves. In a final, desperate act, I dropped my shovel and raised my hands, pleading with them, trying to apologize, to explain that I hadn't meant any harm. But they kept coming, their fingers digging into my skin, dragging me back toward the open grave. I clawed at the earth, trying to find some kind of grip, some way to escape, but it was no use. Their cold, bony hands held me tight, pulling me closer and closer to the waiting darkness below. And then, just as the last of my strength began to fade, I felt something give way beneath me. The ground split open and I was falling, tumbling down into the blackness, the hollow faces of the dead leering at me as I plummeted. I could still hear their shuffling, still feel their cold fingers on my skin as I sank deeper into the earth, the weight of their vengeance pulling me under. And just before the darkness closed over me completely, I heard a voice, a whisper, soft and chilling, echoing through the silence. "Welcome home." I woke up in complete darkness, buried under a suffocating weight that pressed down on my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. My first thought was that I'd been buried alive, entombed beneath the earth by those skeletal hands that had dragged me down. Panic surged through me, and I struggled, clawing at the dirt around me, desperately trying to break free. My fingers hit something solid, wooden, and splintered. The coffin. I was inside a coffin. But how? I'd been above ground only moments before. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pounded on the lid, hoping, praying that someone might hear me. I screamed until my throat was raw, but all that greeted me was silence. I had to get out. I couldn't die down here, not like this. My hands scrambled over the lid, searching for any weak spot, any sliver of hope that I could escape. Then, as my fingers found a loose corner of wood, a faint creak echoed through the darkness. I froze, every muscle in my body tensed as the sound grew louder, closer, until it seemed to be coming from right outside the coffin. My mind raced. Was it the dead coming back to finish what they started? Or something else entirely? The lid shifted just a fraction, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. Slowly, almost teasingly, it creaked open, and I could feel the rush of stale, cold air against my face. I pushed with all my strength, throwing the lid aside, and crawled out, gasping as I reached the surface. But as I stood, I realized I wasn't in the graveyard anymore. I was in some kind of tunnel, dark and damp, with roots twisting down from the ceiling like skeletal fingers. The walls were lined with old, crumbling brick, and the stench of decay filled the air. I turned around, looking for any sign of the graveyard or the night sky, but there was nothing. Only darkness stretching in both directions, swallowing everything beyond a few feet. I hesitated, unsure of which way to go. The silence was thick, almost oppressive. But then I heard it again, the faint shuffling of footsteps echoing through the tunnel. I spun around, trying to pinpoint the source, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere at once. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I knew I wasn't alone. I started walking, my footsteps quickening as the shuffling grew louder, closer. The tunnel twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the earth, and the farther I went, the more I felt like something was watching me, lurking just beyond the edge of the darkness. My breath came in shallow gasps as I turned another corner, only to freeze at the sight before me. There, lying in the middle of the tunnel, was a body, fresh, unlike the skeletal remains I'd seen in the graveyard. Its face was twisted in terror, eyes wide open, staring at me with a haunting familiarity. My stomach churned as I realized I knew that face. It was my co-worker, the guy who was supposed to be on shift before me. He'd been reported missing last week, but no one knew where he'd gone. Now I knew. He'd been pulled down here just like I had. I stumbled back, my mind reeling as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. That's when I noticed the marks on his body, deep gashes like claw marks, running down his arms and chest. The blood was still fresh, glistening in the dim light. And as I looked closer, I saw something even more horrifying. Carved into his forehead, in jagged, uneven letters, was a single word: traitor. My hands shook, and I turned to run, but the tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, twisting and winding in ways that defied logic. The shuffling grew louder, echoing all around me, and I realized with a sickening certainty that the dead weren't just coming for me. They were everywhere, hidden in the shadows, watching, waiting. I ran until my legs burned, my heart racing as I searched for any way out. But the deeper I went, the colder it became, the walls closing in until it felt like I was being buried alive all over again. And then just when I thought I couldn't go any farther, I saw it, a faint light flickering at the end of the tunnel. I sprinted toward it, hope flaring in my chest, but as I got closer, I saw that the light was coming from a single candle set atop a small, makeshift altar. And on that altar lay another coffin, its lid slightly ajar as if inviting me in. The candlelight flickered, casting long shadows across the walls, and I could feel the presence of something sinister lurking just out of sight, watching, waiting for me to make a move. I took a step back, but my foot struck something soft, and I turned to see more bodies lying behind me, their faces frozen in silent screams. The walls seemed to pulse, closing in around me, and I knew that there was no escape. Whatever was down here, it wanted me to stay, to join the others in eternal darkness. A cold whisper echoed through the tunnel, chilling me to the bone. "You disturbed our rest," it hissed, the voice seeming to come from every direction at once. "Now you will never leave." My breath came in ragged gasps as the whisper faded, swallowed up by the silence that pressed in from all sides. I stood there, frozen, staring at the open coffin on the altar. The flickering candlelight cast distorted shadows across the walls, making it seem like the twisted roots and crumbling bricks were alive, watching me with a sinister intent. I took a step back, desperate to get away from the coffin, but as I did, the ground beneath me shifted, as though something was crawling just below the surface. The tunnel seemed to pulse around me, as if it had a heartbeat of its own, quickening to match the racing of my own heart. I wanted to run, to turn back and claw my way to the surface, but the path behind me was gone. I hadn't noticed it before, but the tunnel seemed to have closed off, leaving me with only one direction, forward, toward the altar, toward the open coffin that waited like a hungry maw. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to take a step toward it. Maybe this was some kind of sick joke, a hallucination brought on by too many late nights in the graveyard. But as I approached, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. Inside the coffin, lying atop the rotting silk lining, was a mirror. A small, cracked hand mirror, its glass smeared with something dark and wet. I reached out, almost against my will, and picked it up. The moment my fingers touched the cold glass, a jolt of pain shot up my arm, and the world around me seemed to warp. The walls closed in, the candlelight dimmed, and for a moment everything was silent. Then, in the mirror's reflection, I saw it, my own face, but distorted, twisted with terror, as if something was lurking behind me, ready to strike. I spun around, expecting to see another skeletal figure, but there was nothing, just the darkness and the faint echo of shuffling footsteps somewhere deeper in the tunnel. I looked back at the mirror, hoping that whatever I had seen was just a trick of the light. But the face staring back at me wasn't my own anymore. It was someone else, someone unfamiliar, with hollow eyes and a mouth twisted in a grotesque smile. I dropped the mirror, backing away from it, but it was too late. The whisper returned, louder this time, wrapping around me like a cold, suffocating fog. "You took what was ours," it said, the words dripping with malice. "Now you will give us what is yours." I stumbled back only to feel the cold stone of the altar press against my back. The candle flame flickered wildly, casting shadows that danced across the walls, and in those shadows, I could see them. Figures more than I could count, shifting and swaying, their hollow eyes fixed on me. I was surrounded, trapped in a nightmare that felt all too real. The air grew thick with the stench of decay, and I could feel something clawing at my skin, invisible fingers digging into my flesh, tearing at my clothes. I struggled, trying to free myself, but the more I fought, the tighter their grip became. It was like they were dragging me into the earth, pulling me down into the darkness where they had been waiting all along. My head swam and I could feel my strength fading, the cold seeping into my bones as they pulled me closer, closer to the coffin, closer to the mirror that now lay shattered on the ground. The pieces glinted in the candlelight, each fragment reflecting a different twisted face, each one a ghostly echo of the dead who had been disturbed. I gasped, feeling the icy grip around my throat, and in my last, desperate effort I managed to whisper, "What do you want from me?" The shadows seemed to shudder, and for a moment everything went silent. Then from the darkness a single word echoed through the tunnel, chilling me to the core. "Rest." Before I could comprehend the meaning, the ground gave way beneath me, and I was falling once again, tumbling into the depths of the earth, swallowed by the darkness. The last thing I saw was the candle flame flickering out, leaving me alone in the blackness with only the echo of their laughter to keep me company. And as I fell, I understood the horrifying truth. This wasn't just a graveyard. It was a place of unrest, a place where the dead could never sleep, and now neither could I. The darkness seemed endless as I fell, my body spinning through a void that felt both eternal and claustrophobic. I tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive silence that wrapped around me like a shroud. I couldn't see, couldn't feel, couldn't tell where I was going or if I was moving at all. But then, without warning, I hit solid ground, the impact jarring every bone in my body. I lay there for a moment, disoriented and aching, before I forced myself to my feet. I was in another tunnel, but this one was different. The walls were slick with something wet, and the air was thick with the metallic stench of blood. My fingers brushed against the wall and I pulled back, my hands smeared with a dark, sticky substance. I didn't want to think about what it was. Ahead of me the tunnel stretched on, dimly lit by an unnatural, sickly glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. I could hear the faint sound of whispers, like 1,000 voices murmuring just below the edge of hearing. I tried to make out the words, but they blurred together into a dissonant hum that sent chills down my spine. There was no turning back now. I had to keep moving. As I walked, the tunnel began to change. The walls grew narrower, pressing in on me, the ceiling lowering until I had to stoop to avoid brushing my head against it. The air grew colder, the whispers louder, and I could feel eyes on me, watching, waiting. I turned a corner and my heart nearly stopped. In front of me stood a line of figures, their faces hidden in shadow. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew, somehow, I knew they were the dead, the ones I had disturbed. They stared at me with hollow, accusing eyes, their silence more terrifying than any scream. I tried to back away, but my feet were rooted to the spot, held in place by an unseen force. One of the figures stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. As it approached, I could see its face, or what was left of it. The skin was pale, stretched tight over hollow cheekbones, and its eyes were empty sockets, black as the void. It raised a skeletal hand and pointed at me, its bony finger inches from my face. I felt a wave of cold wash over me, chilling me to the bone. "What do you want?" I managed to whisper, my voice barely more than a breath. The figure tilted its head as if considering my question. Then, in a voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind, it spoke. "You have taken from us. Now, you will give back." Before I could respond, the ground beneath me split open, and I was falling again, but this time, I wasn't alone. The dead were with me, their fingers clawing at my skin, their faces twisted in rage and despair. I fought against them, but they were too many, their cold hands wrapping around me, dragging me down into the darkness. We landed in a cavern, vast and echoing, its walls lined with coffins stacked haphazardly, one on top of the other, reaching up into the shadows. The dead surrounded me, their empty eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I tried to run, but they closed in, blocking every path, trapping me in their midst. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged, taller and more imposing than the others. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, but I could feel its gaze, cold and piercing, as if it could see straight through to my soul. It raised a hand and the dead fell silent, their empty eyes turning toward it in reverence. "You have disturbed our rest," the figure intoned, its voice reverberating through the cavern like thunder. "Now you will take our place." I shook my head, backing away, but there was nowhere to go. The dead surrounded me, their fingers reaching for me, their voices rising in a cacophony of anguish and anger. I could feel them pulling at me, dragging me toward one of the coffins, its lid open and waiting. "No!" I screamed, thrashing against their grip, but it was no use. They were too strong, their cold fingers holding me fast as they forced me into the coffin, pressing me down until I could barely breathe. The hooded figure loomed over me, its shadow stretching across the walls, and I knew with a sickening certainty that this was where I would stay. The lid slammed shut, plunging me into darkness. I pounded on the wood, desperate to escape, but it was solid, unyielding. I could feel the weight of the earth pressing down on me, the cold seeping into my bones. I was trapped, buried alive, with the whispers of the dead filling my ears, their voices a constant, maddening drone. As the darkness closed in, I heard the hooded figure's voice, faint but unmistakable, echoing through the void. "You are ours now. Forever." The darkness was thick and suffocating, pressing in from all sides. I could feel the weight of the coffin around me, the rough wood scraping against my skin as I struggled. I tried to claw my way out, but the lid wouldn't budge, and the whispers of the dead grew louder, a maddening chorus echoing in the silence. Panic surged through me, and I screamed until my throat burned, but there was no one to hear me. I was alone, trapped in the cold embrace of the earth, and it felt like I was sinking deeper with every passing second. Then suddenly there was a faint light, a tiny flickering flame hovering above me just out of reach. It was the candle from the tunnel, the same sickly light that had led me here. It bobbed in the air, dancing just beyond my grasp, and as I reached for it, the lid of the coffin creaked open, just a crack. I pushed with all my strength, forcing it wider until I could crawl out, gasping for air, my heart racing. But I wasn't free. I was back in the cavern, the rows of coffins towering around me, and the dead were waiting, their hollow eyes fixed on me with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. The hooded figure stood before them, silent and unmoving, its face hidden in shadow. I could feel its gaze piercing through me, cold and unforgiving, as it raised a hand and pointed to the ground at my feet. I looked down and my blood ran cold. Beneath me, carved into the earth, was a name, my name. The letters were jagged, etched deep into the ground, and as I stared at them, I understood. This wasn't just a graveyard, it was my graveyard. They had brought me here to stay, to become one of them, to be buried beneath the earth alongside the restless dead. I backed away, my mind racing, searching for any way out. But the figures around me began to move, closing in, their bony fingers reaching for me, their hollow eyes gleaming with a cold, merciless hunger. I turned to run, but the ground shifted beneath me, pulling me down, the earth swallowing me inch by inch, dragging me back into the coffin that awaited me like a hungry mouth. As I struggled, I caught a glimpse of something in the shadows, a reflection, faint and fleeting but unmistakable. It was my own face, staring back at me from the cracked mirror on the altar. But there was something wrong, something twisted and distorted, a hollow darkness in my eyes that hadn't been there before. I looked away, but the image stayed with me, burned into my mind, a horrifying reminder of what I was becoming. I was almost fully submerged now, the earth closing over me, the cold seeping into my bones. My fingers clawed at the ground, desperate to escape, but it was no use. The dead were all around me, their whispers growing louder, drowning out my thoughts, filling my mind with a darkness that seemed to stretch on forever. And as I sank deeper, I realized with a sickening certainty that I was becoming one of them, that my face would soon be staring back at the next poor soul who stumbled into this place. The hooded figure loomed over me, its empty gaze fixed on mine, and as I felt the last of my strength fading, it spoke, its voice a chilling whisper that echoed through the darkness. "Your time is over. Now you will join us." With those words, the earth closed over me, sealing me in darkness, the weight pressing down until I could barely breathe. I felt my body grow cold, my limbs heavy, as the whispers filled my mind, twisting and turning until I could no longer tell where I ended and they began. I was part of them now, trapped in the endless night, bound to this place, forever. And in that final, horrifying moment, as the last flicker of light faded from my mind, I understood the true horror of my fate. I would be waiting here, in the darkness, for the next soul to disturb our rest, to join us in eternal silence, to be dragged down into the earth just as I had been. The graveyard had claimed me, and now I was one of the restless dead,